What goes through a man's mind when he knows he has less than 24 hours to live? Does he regret? Does he remember? Or does he simply wait for the end? Lewis Jones Jr. wasn't just a killer. He was once a hero, a battle-hardened soldier, a decorated Gulf War veteran. He had worn the uniform, carried the flag, and served his country for over 2 decades. He had fought in Grenada. He had trained young soldiers. He had bled for the nation. But none of that mattered now. Now, as the final 24 hours begin, the countdown has started. There are no more courtrooms, no more appeals, just the ticking clock and the silence of death row. But one question remains. Was this his punishment or his escape? This is the story of final 24 hours of a killer, Louis Jones Jr. Born in 1950 in Bemidji, Minnesota, Lewis grew up in a strict and structured household. By all accounts, he was quiet, serious, and focused, a boy who followed the rules. That path led him to the United States Army, where he would build an impressive career over more than 20 years. He served with distinction in conflicts like Grenada and the Gulf War, earning medals in the respect of his fellow soldiers. He rose to the rank of Master Sergeant, a leader, a trainer, a role model. But there were cracks beneath the surface. After retiring from the military, Jones struggled to adjust to civilian life. Friends and family noticed he had changed. He was more withdrawn, angrier, unpredictable. Some would later argue that he had been exposed to nerve agents during the Gulf War, chemicals that may have damaged his brain and affected his behavior. He showed signs of personality change, memory loss, and emotional instability. But at the time, no one could imagine how far things would go. Then came February 18, 1995. That afternoon in San Angelo, Texas, Jones was driving near Goodfellow Air Force Base when he spotted a young woman walking back from the laundry room. Her name was Tracy McBride, a 19-year-old airman who had recently joined the U.S. Air Force. She was smart, determined, and full of life, just starting her journey. Jones pulled up beside her. In his hand, he held a fake badge. He told her there had been a water leak, that she needed to come with him. She trusted him after all. He looked like someone from her own world, a soldier, a man in control. But that trust was a trap. Lewis Jones Jr. drove Tracy to his home. There, he bound her hands, assaulted her, and kept her trapped overnight. The next day, he drove her nearly 90 miles to a remote bridge in Tom Green County. He led her down into a dry creek bed and bludgeoned her to death with a tire iron. Then he left her body in a shallow grave and returned home. For days, the base searched for Tracy, her friends, her family. No one knew what had happened, but the truth came quickly. Louis Jones Jr.'s arrest was swift and inevitable. Jones was quickly identified as the prime suspect. Investigators found fibers, hair, and other evidence that linked him directly to the crime. Once confronted by federal agents, Jones confessed to the kidnapping and murder of McBride, although he tried to justify his actions by citing the trauma he had experienced during his military service. Despite his confession, his past as a decorated Army veteran only added to the shock and disbelief surrounding the crime. Indicted in March 1995, Jones was tried in federal court in Lubbock, Texas, due to the fact that the crime occurred on a military base. His specific charge was kidnapping within special maritime territorial jurisdiction resulting in death. The prosecutor, U.S. Attorney Tanya K. Pierce, argued for the death penalty, a decision that was supported by McBride's family, who had endured the immeasurable pain of losing their daughter in such a violent and senseless way. The trial, which began on October 16, 1995, was moved from San Angelo to Lubbock to avoid the intense media coverage in the former city. The trial was tightly packed with emotions and legal arguments, and the jury selection process was deeply scrutinized. Jones tried to explain his crime by referencing the Gulf War syndrome, claiming that his military service and exposure to chemical agents during the Gulf War had caused brain damage, leading to his violent actions. Evidence showing brain damage was presented during the trial, but it was not enough to convince the jury to show mercy. After just 2 days of testimony and only 65 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Jones guilty on October 23, 1995. And on November 3, 1995, Jones was sentenced to death. Following his sentencing, Jones was transferred to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, TDCJ, and housed at the Ellis Unit near Huntsville, Texas. Later, he was moved to federal custody and placed on death row at U.S. Penitentiary Terre Haute in Indiana. During the appeals process, Jones' defense attorney, Tim Floyd, continued to argue for his sentence to be commuted to life in prison. Floyd sought to present evidence that nerve gas from Iraq had caused irreversible brain damage, contributing to Jones' personality changes and violent outbursts. Notable figures such as U.S. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison and businessman Ross Perot advocated for Jones to receive a life sentence instead of the death penalty. However, McBride's family remained steadfast in their desire for justice, advocating for Jones' execution. What made this case so shocking was not just the horror of the crime, it was the man who committed it. A soldier, a father, a man who had sworn to protect others, now responsible for a young woman's violent death. And so he waited for 8 long years on federal death row. But on March 18, 2003, time ran out. The final 24 hours had begun. It was just past 6 o'clock in the morning when the lights flickered on inside the death row housing unit at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute. For most prisoners, it was just another day. But for Louis Jones, Jr., it was the last time he would wake up. He opened his eyes slowly, his breathing heavy, his body stiff from a night of restless sleep. The mattress beneath him felt harder than usual. The air was colder. Everything felt final. The clank of steel doors, the buzz of overhead lights, sounds he'd grown used to, now rang differently. Every sound echoed like a countdown. In those first moments, he didn't speak. He just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, as if searching for meaning in the sterile gray above him. Was he thinking about Tracy McBride? About her final moments? About his daughter? His ex-wife? Or was he clinging to the memories of his years in uniform when the world saw him as a hero, not a murderer? We may never know. He had declined to see a spiritual advisor that morning. No chaplain, no priest, not even a Bible in hand. He chose silence over prayer, reflection over redemption. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps guilt, or perhaps the weight of everything he had done had already buried his spirit long before this morning. His final breakfast was served quietly: eggs, toast, cereal, and juice. He ate it in silence, slowly, deliberately, as if every bite was a ritual, a moment to delay what he knew was inevitable. Guards stood nearby, calm but watchful. Some had guarded death row before. Others had never witnessed what the next day would bring. Sometime in those early hours, likely between 6 and 9, Jones was allowed something that most inmates on death row never get: one final visit with his daughter. 22-year-old Barbara Jones sat across from the father she barely knew. Separated by years and bars, this would be their final conversation. Witnesses described the moment as heavy and raw, 2 lives tangled in grief, pain, and something deeper, perhaps forgiveness, or at least the attempt. What was said between them remains private, locked forever between father and daughter. But it's not hard to imagine what might have filled that space. Memories not made, birthdays missed, a childhood shaped by absence and now by infamy. Barbara had grown up watching the world judge her father for a horrific crime. But on this day, he wasn't a criminal. He was her dad, and this was goodbye. After the visit, Jones returned to his cell. His steps were slow, his face reportedly unreadable. Whatever was said in that room stayed with him. Outside his cell, the corridors were unusually still. The normal chaos of prison life was absent. A hush blanketed the walls. Staff walked with measured steps, glancing occasionally toward the small secured unit that held the man whose life would end in less than 24 hours. There were no tears, no begging, no outbursts, just a quiet acceptance. A man once trained to fight wars, now preparing to surrender to death. As the clock inched past noon, the sky above Terre Haute was pale and indifferent. The prison yard remained quiet, no shouting, no movement. Inside, time moved slower than ever for Louis Jones, Jr. Each tick of the clock was like a countdown, a whisper of finality. By this point, he had been moved from his regular cell to the death watch cell, a smaller, more sterile room just a few feet from the execution chamber. No windows, no bars, just thick walls and silence. He had no television, no distractions, only the creeping reality of what lay ahead. Then, sometime that afternoon, his lawyers came in to speak with him one last time. They were solemn, professional, but what they had to say was devastating, even if not unexpected. They informed him that his final appeal for clemency to President George W. Bush had been officially denied. The U.S. Supreme Court had also refused to intervene. It was over. That final sliver of legal hope, the one that sometimes came at the 11th hour for others, was gone. But now, standing in front of Jones, the words were final. There would be no stay, no delay, no mercy. He listened quietly. No visible reaction, no outburst, no protest. Some said he looked resigned. Others say he simply stared at the floor, nodding once, as if he had already known what they were going to say. Perhaps he had spent the last few nights rehearsing this moment in his mind, preparing to hear it. Or maybe he had already stopped hoping. After meeting his lawyer, Jones came back to his cell. Alone in his holding cell, he wrote letters. Letters to his family, to his daughter, and perhaps to anyone he thought might listen. It was in these letters that he expressed what many believed were his final, most honest words. In a statement later read by his attorney, Jones said, "I accept full responsibility for the pain, anguish, and the suffering I caused the McBrides for having taken Tracy from them." These words seemed to carry a weight, an attempt to own up to the brutality of his actions, though it could never bring the McBride family the peace they deserved. He was no longer a decorated war hero, a man who had served with distinction. He wasn't the master sergeant who had risen through the ranks and earned medals. He was a man at the end of his journey, a man facing his own reckoning. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same military that had once elevated him now had its fingerprints all over his fall. During the afternoon, Jones also spent time reading the Bible. For many, this would be a moment of profound reflection, a moment where the soul could seek some sort of reconciliation before the inevitable end. The pages of the Bible, worn and well-loved, may have offered Jones a sense of solace, or at least a way to calm his nerves. The words he read were not just scripture, but a last attempt to find peace with himself, with God, and with his past. And now, with the sun dipping low beyond the razor wire, he sat in the last place he would ever know. The sky above Terre Haute, Indiana darkened slowly that Tuesday, casting long shadows across the concrete walls of the U.S. penitentiary. Inside, time was doing something strange. For everyone else, the hours ticked by. But for Louis Jones, Jr., the clock was no longer a countdown. It was a metronome, marking the final rhythm of a man waiting to die. By evening, the procedures for his execution were already unfolding behind the scenes. Guards moved with deliberate calm. Medical staff stood on standby. The gurney had been prepared. The viewing rooms were swept and ready. There were no surprises left. Only protocol. Jones had spent most of the day in quiet reflection. Around 10 o'clock that night, Jones was served his last meal. It wasn't heavy. He didn't ask for steak or fried chicken or comfort food. Instead, he requested a small bowl of peaches, plums, and nectarines, 3 soft fruits, sweet and bruised by the weight of time, not unlike the man who chose them. He ate them alone in his cell adjacent to the execution chamber. It was a quiet, almost poetic choice, simple, unassuming, and free from indulgence. Some would later wonder what the fruits meant. Were they a reminder of childhood, of summer days long gone, or just the only thing he could stomach before the end? After the meal, he was given time to shower and change. Like every federal execution, he was dressed in fresh prison-issued clothes, likely white, clean, sterile, worn, not for life, but for death. Jones was then moved to the death watch cell, a small concrete room just feet from the execution chamber. This is where he would spend his final hours. The lights would remain on through the night. Guards kept watch. A Bible was placed nearby. He read that in a silent. From the battlefield to death row, the fall of Louis Jones Jr. was complete. The man who had once trained soldiers now sat in a cell awaiting lethal injection. And somewhere, Tracy McBride's family waited too. And as the clock crept toward dawn, the world outside slept. But inside that prison, time stood still, just long enough for a man to feel the weight of everything he'd done, and everything he had lost. The final hour had arrived. Just before dawn, Louis Jones Jr. was escorted from his holding cell and led into the federal death chamber at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute. The same chamber where Timothy McVeigh and Juan Raul Garza had died 2 years earlier. Now it was his turn. He offered no resistance, no final words of defiance. He walked calmly, draped in white, like a man who had already accepted that redemption, if it would come, would not come from this world. At 7 o'clock sharp, the curtain to the chamber was drawn open. On one side of the glass, behind reinforced windows, sat the witnesses Jones had invited, 4 loved ones and supporters, and 8 members of the press. In front of them, strapped tightly to a gurney, Jones raised his head and mouthed the words, "I love you." But he did not look, not even once, toward the other side of the room. Behind a separate pane of one-way glass, hidden from his view, sat the family of Tracy McBride, the mother, father, and sister of the young woman he had kidnapped, raped, and murdered. They had waited 8 long years for this moment, but Jones never acknowledged them. Then, in a raspy voice, Jones began to speak, not to the room, not to the family, but to something far beyond. "The Lord hath chastened me sore, but he hath not given me over unto death." Psalm 118:18. He then began singing, hoarsely but clearly, a hymn called, "Jesus, Keep Me Near the Cross." In the cross, be my glory ever, till my raptured soul shall find rest beyond the river. As he sang, a Bureau of Prisons official interrupted to formally list the charges for which he was convicted: the brutal abduction, rape, and murder of Private Tracy Joy McBride. Jones didn't stop singing. Even as the speaker inside the chamber was turned off, he kept singing. At 7:06 a.m., the first of 3 drugs was administered. It was sodium thiopental. It is a fast-acting sedative intended to render him unconscious. His eyes froze open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His lips parted slightly as though caught mid-verse. 1 minute later, at 7 o'clock, the second drug, a paralytic, was pushed into his veins. Finally, at 7 or 8, the third chemical, potassium chloride, stopped his heart. Louis Jones Jr. was pronounced dead. He became only the 3rd federal prisoner executed since the U.S. reinstated capital punishment for federal crimes, following Timothy McVeigh and Juan Raul Garza. But unlike those men, Jones died in near anonymity. No national headlines, no media circus, just a song, a verse from Scripture, and silence. His daughter Barbara Jones did not witness the execution. When his attorney read that letter, Tracy's family was not satisfied. Her sister Stacy McBride, wearing a badge with Tracy's photo, spoke for them all. The tears we have shed today are not for Lewis Jones. They are for Tracy, and for Tracy alone. Stacy McBride was 24 years old at the time, studying to become a prosecutor, and she could not believe that Jones had refused to face them. "He did not even acknowledge us," she said. "The whole thing was very self-serving. It was unbelievable." Jones' body was released to his family. Under a 1997 federal law passed after fears that McVeigh might be buried with military honors, he was barred from burial in a veteran cemetery. His family instead chose to bury him in Chicago. His minister, Reverend J. Jason Fry, was there to witness the death. And as the prison lights dimmed, he reflected on the man whose soul had just slipped away. A daughter has lost her father. Grandchildren will never know their grandfather. Now another family has been devastated. But for Tracy McBride's mother, Irene, the moment wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. "Today was a day of justice for Tracy," she said quietly. "It's been a long 8 years, and the healing process is not over." In the final hours, Lewis Jones Jr. faced the consequences of a crime that shattered lives. But behind the uniform, behind the salute, was a man broken long before he committed an unforgivable act. Tracy McBride's light was stolen far too soon, and her story remains a painful reminder that justice doesn't always bring peace, only finality. So the questions he left behind are still very much alive. How does a decorated war hero become a killer? Could the unseen wounds of war have pushed him past the edge? And what could have been done before it was too late? What do we owe the victims? What do we owe the soldiers? And what happens when justice and tragedy walk hand in hand? Thank you for watching. If this story gave you something to think about, subscribe for more true crime justice cases. These stories deserve to be told.